You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we're joined today by Lindsey Wade, author of In My DNA, My Career Investigating Your Worst Nightmares. Lindsey, thank you for joining us on Mind Over Murder today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Go ahead and start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your professional background.
So I am a native of Tacoma, Washington, and still live in this neck of the woods. I am a retired law enforcement officer, so I worked for the Tacoma, Washington Police Department for 21 years and spent 14 of those years as a detective working primarily sex crimes and homicide cases, some missing person cases in there and a few other kinds of violent crimes, and then spent the last 3 years as our cold case detective. Then after I left the department, I went and worked for the Attorney General's office in Washington State, and I helped to create the SACI program in Washington State, which is the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative. Worked on that project, and we had a couple different purpose areas for that grant at the time. We had one purpose area that addresses the testing of sexual assault kits, and then we had another purpose area that addressed something called Lawfully Owed DNA, which is a program aimed to collect DNA samples from convicted offenders who slipped through the cracks and never had their DNA entered into CODIS. That's my background in a nutshell. Now I no longer work for the AG's office. I now work for a global nonprofit. I still have my fingers involved in this world of investigations in my current role because I act as a liaison to law enforcement agencies around the country.
I'd like to put a pin in this whole discussion about lawfully owed DNA, because this is an area that we both find very troubling and something that we believe that all of us as a nation should be focused on. Let's put a pin in that for a moment, because there's so much more to talk about just in terms of introducing you and your fascinating history.
I want to start just with the title of the book because it's great. So the title of the book, as I said at the top, is In My DNA. If someone asked you the question, Lindsey, what is in your DNA? What would your answer be?
Murder.
I think that's in all our DNA right now.
Yeah.
Such a lovely, upbeat thing to have in your DNA.
And just to give you guys some perspective, so I was at a retreat this last weekend with a credit union that I sit on the board of directors for. And the CEO of the credit union was asking me after our meeting was over, what'd you do today? Did you go out and go shopping or do something fun? And I was like, yeah, I went to the shops, and then I came back to my room and started researching the serial killer. And he just looked at me and he was like, okay. I like, why? Why not?
That sounds like conversations I have with my friends. What are you doing? Oh, I told somebody, I said, I got to go home and podcast about child murder. And they were like,
yeah.
Did they not understand your professional background? Did they think of you as being on the board of directors and not as
no, he knows.
Former cop?
He knows what my background is, but I don't know. Maybe they just think it's much more compartmentalized, like you only do that when you're at work or something. And that's definitely not me.
Would you think of solving murder as being one aspect of your life's work?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So like Kristin
says, a big aspect.
It's not something you just put down. This is a passion for you.
Absolutely. It's more of a calling than I would say a job. And that's one of the things I talk about in at the book's conclusion, is that I may not be a detective anymore. I may not be getting called out to crime scenes anymore. It doesn't really matter because I'm always going to be interested and I'm always going to be asking questions and probably sticking my nose where it doesn't belong, but that's okay because that's how you get shit done.
Agreed. So murder is in your DNA. Is there anything else that you would say is like deeply ingrained in you as part of your DNA?
Just a sense of justice, and I just really caring for and caring about victims of violent crime. And I just think that too often they get forgotten, and we talk a lot about other things related to the criminal justice system, but I feel like the families and the victims oftentimes get lost and forgotten about. And for me, that's the most motivating part of doing this kind of work, is when I do connect with a family. And the cases that I talk about in the book, a lot of those cases were extremely impactful to me because I had a connection with the victim or the family. Or it's not just like slapping the handcuffs on somebody. That's good. It feels good to be able to do that, but it feels even better to be able to give a family that news that you've solved the case, or to be able to connect with the victim and let them know that they weren't forgotten about and that you were able to do something to help them.
So what made you decide that now was the right time to tell your story about your life as a detective?
I think that I knew along the way in my career that I had worked on some very interesting cases, and I could probably write them down and write a book one day, but I never really thought that I could do it while I was still working as a detective. For one thing, I just thought, like, when would the story actually end? Because the cases just keep on coming. So that was one aspect of it. Plus, I just didn't feel like I was in the right frame of mind or had the time. So once I retired from police work, I felt that I did have the time and the energy and the willingness to go back through those cases and revisit them. And I sat down one day and made a list, and I wrote down the cases that I wanted to include in the book. And they were all cases that I felt were impactful to me for one reason or another. And I decided those were the cases that I was going to write about. And it turned out that all of them ended up being cases involving either women or young girls who had been victimized.
Let's start off then with the Jennifer Bastian case. For someone that is not familiar with her case, and it certainly was high profile, but not everyone will know the story, can you tell us a little bit about that case?
So there were actually two little girls who went missing and were murdered in Tacoma back in 1986. And this was during my childhood. So I was, I think, 10 when a little girl by the name of Michelle Welch was killed. And then I had turned 11 by the time Jennifer Bastian was killed. These were two cases that were just completely outrageous. They shocked the community. They were cases that everyone knew about. And still to this day, if you talk to anybody who's lived here for more than 20 years, they know these cases. It was just terrifying to think that two little kids on two different events, 2 different days, could just be out doing what kids do, which is going to the park, riding a bike, and they go missing. And with Michelle, she had been at a local community park with her sisters. She went home to go get lunch for her sisters, and when she came back to the park, they were not there. It turns out they had gone to a nearby business to use the restroom. And when they came back from the restroom, they saw that she had been back. Her bike was there, and the lunch that she brought from the house was there, but she was nowhere to be found. They searched for her, couldn't find her, and they ended up calling a babysitter and then ultimately their mom. And the police were called, and they initiated a massive search of the area, and they ended up bringing in search and rescue. This was middle of the day on I believe it was a Wednesday. Later that night, close to midnight, they finally found her body. And she had been taken into a wooded area adjacent to the park and had been sexually assaulted and murdered. So that happened in March of 1986. It was a big story, and people were in fear. This is a very well-to-do area of Tacoma. It was not a high-crime area, and this was just unexpected. This random act of violence was just not normal. So police were investigating that case and really not coming up with a ton of good leads. And then fast forward 4.5 months, and it happens again. Same area of town, same type of victim. And in this case, it was Jennifer Bastian, who was 13. Also blonde-haired, blue-eyed, out riding a bike in another park in the same area of town. She had left a note for her dad saying she'd be home by 6 p.m. She was going to ride around this paved path in the park called the 5 Mile Drive. She left for the park. There were lots of people that said they saw her at the park riding her bike in various areas along the path, and she never came home. Her parents searched for her, and then police were called. Police flew into action pretty quickly on this case because of the other case. Based on the similarities, it was like, okay, this does not sound good, and it sounds eerily similar to the Michelle Welch case. So they also brought in search and rescue pretty quick. They tracked from the Bastian home to the park. The dogs picked up her scent in the park, but they did not locate her. She was ultimately missing for 24 days before her body was finally located within the park in a wooded area. She too had been sexually assaulted and murdered. And those two cases just went unsolved. So from 1986 until 2018, they were just unsolved cases. Really, they became urban legend in this area because they were just so horrific. And it was hard to believe that these two crimes could occur and the person could still be out there walking around and not committing other crimes just like it. It was definitely thought that it was the same suspect who killed both girls based on these similarities. And we later learned, based on DNA testing, that wasn't the case. It was two separate guys, which was shocking. Like 28 years after the fact, we find out it's two different guys. Still, we don't know who they are because the DNA comes back and it's still no matches in CODIS for either suspect.
Would you say that the rape and murder of these two little girls, did that enter into your decision? You're a little kid at this point, just a young girl yourself. And yet, years later, you decide you want to go into law enforcement. Is there a relationship between what happened to them and your own life?
Yeah. I don't see how it couldn't have had some impact on my decision-making, whether it was a conscious decision or subconscious. But there were a few things that happened along the way of my childhood that definitely led me down the path and got me interested in law enforcement and interested in wanting to be a detective, and specifically a homicide detective. The book starts out with me talking about waking up when I was 8 years old and finding a stranger inside my bedroom, which was absolutely terrifying. And then you fast forward a couple of years and I talk about the murders of these two girls in my community. And when I talk to my friends, I can talk to friends, neighbors. I could go to the local bar and bring up the cases and somebody would start talking about it. Everybody was impacted in some way by these two cases. And it's hard to really describe, but it really changed how kids were raised in our area. Mm-hmm. There was no more free range parenting. You weren't going to walk by yourself anywhere. You weren't going to ride your bike anywhere. Parents really kept a close eye on their kids, closer than they had before this happened. And there was a lot of speculation about who could have done it. There was a lot of paranoia, I would say, about who had done it, especially since they just went unsolved. So it really had a big impact. And I think for young girls like myself, it just scared the hell out of us. It really told us for the first time ever that there's really bad people out there. Mm-hmm. And up until that time, that just didn't even factor into anything, didn't factor into how we lived our lives. So fast forward from there to high school, that's when I picked up a copy of Ann Rule's book, The Stranger Beside Me, and started reading about Ted Bundy, who was also from Tacoma, by the way. Once I read that book, I was just hooked. That was it. I knew I wanted to be a detective.
It's funny, Lindsey, I was reading all of this and it actually sounds similar to what happened with me. I also was impacted very strongly by Bill's sister's case, the Colonial Parkway Murders, because that also took on the stature of urban legend here. Mm-hmm. And it did impact the way that people raised their kids, warned them about the Parkway. And then it wasn't Ann Rule for me, but it was John Douglas and Mark Olshaker's Mindhunter and all of those series. But I wasn't brave enough to do what you did. I didn't go into law enforcement. I went into teaching. But that's bravery on its own, I guess.
I was going to say, I don't think I could do that. So my hat's off to you.
A different kind of bravery.
But yeah, I was reading this and going, you know what? I get this. This is very resonant in a lot of ways. Just while we're on the subject of Ted Bundy, just for 1 second, why is it that the Pacific Northwest seems to be a hot spot for notorious serial killers? Because you've got Bundy and the Green River Killer, just to name two. Any insight into why that might be? Is it the weather? Is it what is it?
If I knew the answer to that question, I would probably be a billionaire. Who knows? Yes, so many different things I've heard. The weather, I've heard the fact that we were military and port city. I've heard that the terrain. Look, you got plenty of places to bury and just dump bodies out in the wilderness here. It doesn't really correlate for those serial killers that you mentioned, but we do have a disproportionate amount of violent crime here. Historically, we've had, even just like in my specific area, a disproportionate amount of violent crime, because what happens is a lot of times the prisons will just dump people in our county and in our city after they get out for a variety of reasons, but primarily because supposedly we have more services here or something, or they have a better chance of rehabilitating. And so we end up with a large proportion of people here that are not even from here, but they committed crimes that sent them to prison, and then they get dumped here after they get released. So that's a problem. And I think that is less today than it was in like the 80s and 90s, but it still happens. So,
that must mean you've got a pretty hefty recidivism rate then, is that right?
Yeah, depending on the crime type, but yes. So that's a problem. That could be a factor with some of it. But yeah, I don't know. There are a lot of things going on up here.
all I can say is I'm so glad we didn't blame the coffee. Or all the great rock and roll that's come out of the Pacific Northwest in the last 30 years.
Yes.
As long as coffee and grunge rock are not blamed, I think
we'll leave Nirvana and Soundgarden and Pearl Jam. They're all safe.
Exactly. Some of my favorites. The other factors, I think, the heavy military presence, and I come from a military family, so I'm not taking a shot at anybody. The transience factor, I think, is very real, because so many people come through there because of the type of work and the ports. I think about people that have been involved in shipping and receiving civilian and military craft coming and going, and even things like people heading to Alaska and Canada and places like that. I can't exactly put my finger on it, but I feel like there's just a lot of movement of people, and that would allow someone who has dark predilections to hide in plain sight, because there's always going to be a stranger in a flannel shirt walking through town.
Absolutely.
In Jennifer and Michelle's cases, what kind of involvement, if any, did NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, have in their investigation?
I don't believe so. I don't recall seeing anything in the case files that indicated involvement. Michelle was found the same day that she went missing, and Jennifer was missing for almost a month, but I don't think so.
And at what year are you finally at a point where you're looking at their case files, which obviously are cold cases at this point?
So I first got involved with their cases. It was maybe 2012, 2013, somewhere in there. My partner at the time, Detective Gene Miller, he knew that I was interested in cold cases, and we had received a grant from NIJ in 2012 to actually reinvestigate a lot of our cold cases using DNA. And so the cases were farmed out to detectives within the unit to look at, and we all took a case. But he knew that I was very interested in cold cases in general. I had voluntarily taken on a cold case back when I was in sex crimes of a missing little girl. And so it was just like a passion of mine. I don't really remember how it happened, but around 2012, 2013, I was in contact with a former FBI profiler that I had just remained friends with over the years, who retired from the FBI and moved on to NCMEC. We talked from time to time about cases, and she thought Jennifer and Michelle's cases would be good cases to present at NCMEC for a full case review. Gene and I traveled to Alexandria and did a 2-day presentation. So we did Michelle's case the first day and then Jennifer's the second day for that panel of experts that they pulled together, which was, I don't know, like 25 or so experts from various fields. We walked through the cases. So that was really like my first in-depth involvement with the cases and reading through them and meeting Jennifer's mom and dad at that time. Michelle's family was out of state by that point, but Jennifer's parents were still local.
As I was reading through the book, some very familiar names were jumping off the page for me. And two of those are Colleen Fitzpatrick and Dr. Barbara Ray Venter. Can you talk a little bit about the roles that they played in helping you investigate Jennifer's homicide? And I think you could definitely say that they helped lead to that eventual closure of the case. So you tell us about Dr. Fitzpatrick and Dr. Barbara Ray Venter. They're amazing, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. I first learned about Colleen Fitzpatrick it was like 2015. There were detectives who came up from Phoenix to Washington, and they were following up on the murder cases down there, the two cases from 1990 and 91, I think they were.
Yeah, the canal killings.
Yeah. They were telling me about how they had solved the case, and they were doing follow-up on Miller because he was he wasn't from Washington, but he had been living in Washington at some point.
Right, he'd lived up
and he had attacked a girl on a jogging trail or something.
Mm-hmm. Very similar.
And so they were up in my neck of the woods, and I don't actually remember what the nexus was to Tacoma, but for some reason they were in Tacoma and needed some help from us. We got to talking about their cases, and they told me about how they had gotten the lead on Miller's name from Colleen Fitzpatrick, and I'm like, say what?
Really? How's this work?
Yeah, okay, this sounds crazy to me. I'm no genealogist. It just was completely foreign to me. I said, I'm going to need her number because I want to talk to her. I've got these two cases. We've got DNA in both cases. We've got no matches in CODIS. Let's see what we can do. So that's how I first met Colleen. And at this time, we really had no funding for cold case investigations. Luckily, I had an FBI agent who was working with me on these two cases. And the FBI, his bosses had basically given him permission to pretty much work full time with me on these two cold cases and also fund some of the work that was being done because my agency was not in a position to pay for it. They ended up paying for the work that Colleen did, because all these things are expensive, and it's unfortunate that cost is so prohibitive for doing a lot of these things in cold cases, but that's the reality at this point. Colleen ended up providing me with, I think it was 3 potential surnames for the suspect in Jennifer's case, and then 2 or 3 potential surnames for the suspect in Michelle's case. At that point, it was like, all right, this is interesting, and I'm going to file it away and add it to my list of potential leads, but not really sure what to do with this at the moment. It took me about 3 months to go through the case files and get them organized and add all of the male names from both cases into a database so that I could actually make sense of everyone and track everyone and organize them and prioritize them for DNA collection, because I knew eventually DNA was going to solve these cases. Mm-hmm. And it was just a matter of how do we get DNA from all these people? So I just started running these individuals that were in the case file one by one, looking up their criminal history, basically ranking them. So I would prioritize people. I color-coded them. They're high priority, they're medium, they're low. Do we already have their DNA collected, either because they're in CODIS already for a previous conviction, or did we collect their DNA at some point along the way as a part of the investigation? These were all things that I was tracking. Once I got the database in order, we ended up doing this child abduction response team activation. And this was in conjunction with the 30-year anniversary of the 2 murders. We wanted to do something big to get the cases back out into the public eye, but also to potentially get some new leads in on the cases. And this is like right at the very beginning of phenotyping coming to light and Parabon coming on the scene doing the digital sketches based on the DNA. And so I had those 2 things done. So we had some new things to share with the public that we thought would capture the interest of people, but also maybe prompt people to come forward and give us information. Did a 2-day exercise of our child abduction response team. Normally when we do these things, when we do like an exercise for CART, that's the short for child abduction response team, we just call it CART. Normally when we do one of these, we use a fictitious case, right? And we just do a mock drill for our team. But in this case, I said, you know what? We've got the 30-year anniversary. We've got these 2 cold cases. They're both child abduction murders. Why don't we use these 2 cases and actually have the potential of making some progress on these cases as opposed to just doing this mock exercise? So that's what we did. Instead of issuing an Amber Alert at the beginning on day 1, we did a press conference and we invited all the media there. And we had big posters of the 2 Parabon sketches. We had visual timelines on both cases laid out for the media. And then we announced to the public for the first time that we had 2 different killers, which blew people away.
Wow, so, that was the first time you actually said that publicly. People had to be floored because the assumption for 30 years was that these 2 cases are linked.
Yes.
Holy smoke.
So it absolutely blew people away. And we ended up getting, I don't know, over 100 new tips that came in. One of the other things that we did behind the scenes during that activation over the 2 days was we went out and collected DNA from tons of people. We had teams of detectives and FBI agents, and they were all given packets of names of people from our list that were high priority people that we wanted to get DNA from. And so we sent them out to go knock on people's doors and get a cheek swab.
Tell us a little bit more about that. Can you compel someone to give their DNA? What's the exchange like? What's the conversation like between members of law enforcement and at least potential suspects? How does that go?
So basically, we would show up on somebody's doorstep, identify ourselves as the either police or FBI, whoever happened to be there, and let them know we were investigating a cold case or a couple of cold cases from 1986. Your name came up in the case, and we would like to eliminate you as a potential suspect. They can either say, yep, go ahead, or no, pound sand and slam the door in your face. We only had I think we had 9 people refuse. And we ended up collecting 160 samples during that time.
Wow.
The vast majority of people say yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And what's your investigator's instinct say to you? 9 people out of 170 or so, people say no. 160, round numbers, say yes. Does that make your investigator's instinct suspect the 9 people more than the 160?
No. That was the bizarre thing about this case, is if you looked at the criminal history of the people on this list, it would literally shock you that these people could be out walking around in society. So it didn't make me think that, because you look at one person and they're worse than the next, and then you look at the next person and they're worse than the last person. And so I really was at a point where I could not gauge at all just by looking at someone's history, or even just somebody saying no, because that's their right. They don't have to give DNA. Just because someone said no, it would depend on why they were on the list to begin with, as to how interested I was in them. But the reality was I had so many people to collect DNA from that when someone would say no, I would just note it and move on to the next person, because I had so many people to try to track down. Who knows? If the cases hadn't been solved the way they were, we would have had to go back and revisit those people and figure out, is there anything else we can do to get a DNA sample?
We do want people to buy the book, of course. I don't know how comfortable you feel about potentially spoiling the end of Jennifer's case, but are you willing to tell us about it, or should we just say, hey, if you want to know, buy the book?
I will just say that both Colleen Fitzpatrick and Barbara Ray-Venter were absolutely critical to these cases, and I respect both of them so much because they were trailblazers. When I first started working with Colleen, this is 2015, so this is before the advent of what we know today as forensic genealogy. She's still working with YSTR profiles. This is not, she wasn't even at the stage yet that she is at today. And then with Barbara, I met Barbara, or started working with her in, I think, the end of 2016. I heard about her from someone at NCMEC at a homicide conference. Mm-hmm. And I heard about the Lisa case out of California and how she had identified that girl. And then reached out to her to say, if you can identify an unknown living victim, could you identify an unknown suspect using the same method? Pre-Golden State Killer, this is pre all of that. And her answer was yes, theoretically, it'll work. That's how we started working together. And obviously the rest is history. But read the book.
Read the book.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. Were there doubters? You're working with a lot of different investigators, including veterans. Mm-hmm. Were there doubters? Were there people that said, there's no way, Lindsey, that this is going to work to help you solve this and other cases?
If they thought that, they never said it to me. Not that it would have mattered anyway if someone did say that. Because I felt like, what do we have to lose at this point? Mm-hmm. We've turned over so many rocks. We've collected all this DNA. We've done all these things. What else can we do except hope that this person gets arrested and convicted for a new crime that puts them in the database? And frankly, I wasn't willing to sit around and wait for that day. It was my former partner, Detective Gene Miller. When I told him about Colleen, he scratched his head and he was like, that sounds interesting, but do it. Like, why not? What do we got to lose? I think that most of the people that I worked closely with accepted that I was a very outside the box thinker. Like to try different things. And I don't know. I just look at things from a different perspective.
Tell us a little bit about Jennifer and Michelle's law that you helped to pass in 2019. Can you give us a rundown of what does the law do and like why is it so very important?
Yeah, absolutely. So that law, we went down to Olympia, which is our state capital, for, I believe it was 4 years in a row, going down and testifying in front of the legislature to try to get some form of this bill passed. And when I say we, Jennifer Bastian's mother, in some years, her cousin, her sister, Jennifer's sister, also lives out of state but would write letters. They have a ton of supporters. We had a lot of people writing letters. And unfortunately, we didn't get any traction for the first 3 years. And then finally in 2019, we had Representative Tina Orwell, who has been really a powerhouse in Washington state, passing all kinds of legislation related to sexual assault testing and sexual assault investigations. And so she really helped to spearhead this legislation and move it forward. Once we finally got the law passed, I'd asked that it be named Jennifer and Michelle's law so that we wouldn't forget why this is so important. And these two girls, we need to remember them. My theory at the time that we first started pushing for this law was that the suspect was probably slipped through the cracks somehow. Was probably one of these guys that like either died in prison or was in prison somewhere today, never had their DNA collected. And we've seen example over time of this happening all around the country. So that was my thought process and really my motivation for trying to strive for changing the law in Washington. Because what we had was every state's got different DNA laws, and every state usually has a continuum of the DNA law and how it changes over time. Most states passed their original DNA laws back in the early 1990s. And in Washington, our DNA law only addressed violent crimes and sex crimes and convictions. So you had to be convicted of a violent crime or a sex crime in order to have your DNA collected. And then eventually the law progressed to all felonies in 2002. And then they started adding in some gross misdemeanors as well. There are lots of loopholes in the law with regard to people slipping through and getting convicted for qualifying offenses, but never actually getting collected. The thing that I noticed and that what really stood out to me were people who died. Inmates who died in prison or just really bad guys, really bad serial offenders, serial rapists, serial murderers who were dead. We didn't have DNA for and who we legally couldn't get DNA for because they didn't qualify under our law. And that's what's mind blowing if you really think about that, because we don't limit timeframes on submitting evidence from homicide cases or sexual assault cases to CODIS, right? Like you could go back to the 40s if you had it and submit it to CODIS on the evidence side. But for the offender side, most states have rules that say you cannot enter DNA from offenders prior to the DNA law taking effect. Or if they're already out of custody now, you can't get their DNA. There's no mechanism in place to put their DNA into CODIS. In Washington, I had come up with lots of examples of really bad guys, really horrific offenders who, in my mind, should be in CODIS for the purpose of solving cold cases. Not only were they absent from CODIS, we legally could not put them in, even if we could track down a sample of their DNA. And so that is what Jennifer and Michelle's law has done. It's changed that law so that now, regardless of your conviction date, even if you were convicted in 1975 or 1980, if your offense would qualify today, then you're eligible to be entered into CODIS if law enforcement can legally obtain a sample and it can go into CODIS for the purpose of solving cold cases.
We appreciate you being so innovative. And I know it's not just you, but a lot of people work on this law. But we've talked to Rock Harmon and other guests on Mind Over Murder. We are both civilians. But we are shocked at the CODIS gap, as Rock was referring to it. Mm-hmm. The fact that there are rapists and murderers, convicted rapists and murderers, some of whom are currently incarcerated, some of whom may actually be out, hopefully living a reasonable life and moving forward. But they were still convicted rapists and murderers whose DNA is not in the system. I will continue saying this until we figure out as a country how to fix this, much in the same way Washington State did. This should be a national scandal. Rock feels that there are tens of thousands of offenders whose DNA should be in the system who are not in the system.
Right. I don't even think that we can accurately gauge what the number is, but it's such a convoluted and complicated issue because not all states even would allow DNA to be collected from someone who's no longer incarcerated. Let's say you get convicted of a murder in 2010, which is not that long ago, and you do your time when you get out. In some states, once you're out, that's it. If the law enforcement or the correction system had the opportunity to get your DNA and they didn't, too bad. There's no mechanism in place to compel people in those situations to provide a DNA sample. And again, it varies from state to state. Everyone's different, but that's not uncommon and not unusual.
It's completely unacceptable. There are a lot of things about this country that I find very disturbing. And the fact that we've allowed ourselves to develop a system with 50 different approaches to the same problem is insane. And this is the kind of thing that needs to be changed at the federal level. I'm very passionate about this. I'm the brother of a murder victim whose case is currently unsolved. Kristin and I are working with 8 families whose loved ones were killed as part of the Colonial Parkway murders. We're living this. This is unacceptable, and this needs to be addressed. And I'm going to put this on squarely in the lap of the Department of Justice. We need to fix this at a national level. It's great that you made such strides in Washington State, and it makes me feel good to see that the situation can be improved. We have to do better than this. The idea that convicted rapists and murderers are walking around who still have to check in many cases with their parole officers. So why not collect their DNA the next time they're in for a face-to-face meeting with their parole officer as a condition of their parole?
And I just think that there are a lot of assumptions made by people that, if they went to prison and they got convicted of a rape or a murder, of course their DNA would have been collected. There's just too many assumptions. There's a lot of finger pointing that goes on because these statutes are murky. And so if somebody gets missed along the way, then there oftentimes is no mechanism in place to verify that the person actually did get collected. And that's where people are slipping through.
In addition to working these cases, which of course is very difficult, you do have a child of your own. Has working on these cases affected how you interact with her and the precautions that you take about her safety?
Yeah. My husband and I are both retired law enforcement. It's hard. It's hard to know what and really know the worst things that have happened in your community and then let your young daughter go out and have some sense of freedom. Yeah. I've gotten better over time, but it hasn't been easy. I will say that.
So what is next for you in terms of projects? Or can we expect another book?
Oh, goodness. I don't know if I have the energy at this point for another book, but I do have a couple of podcast projects in the works.
Yay!
So that I'm really excited about that. One of the projects is I've teamed up with a local journalist here in Washington, and she and I are going back and looking at some cases that happened back in the 1970s here in Washington. And they are a variety of solved and unsolved cases, but all linked to the same serial killer that no one's ever heard of. It should be very interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, Carolyn Osorio, she's a journalist out of Seattle. She actually has her own podcast. She has 2 different podcasts. One of them is called The Shadow Girls, and that one is a series about the Green River, the victims of the Green River Killer.
Oh, yeah.
Then the other one that she's currently doing is called The Murder Chronicles. And that is I think it's a weekly podcast where she covers different cases. And I don't think they're all Washington-based cases, but she's really great. She's really passionate, and she's made some great connections with some of the victims and family members in these cases that we're working on. So I'm just really excited to do it, and I think it's going to be really impactful. I hope that we actually get some answers for some of these families.
It sounds like the two of you would make a phenomenal team working together.
Yeah.
The book is called In My DNA, My Career Investigating Your Worst Nightmares. Lindsey, where can everybody find your book?
My book is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any of the ebook platforms, and it's also available via audiobook.
Lindsey, thank you so much for joining us today on Mind Over Murder. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.